Let's begin, though, with who Tim Walz is and what he brings to the Democratic ticket. CBC's Richard Madden joins us from Washington. Hello, Richard. Thanks for being here. So, how much of a surprise is this pick?
Yeah, it's somewhat surprising. You know, I thought Harris would go with Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania. He's popular, dynamic. He runs the biggest swing state on the map, and if Democrats win Pennsylvania, that's the ball game. But Harris reportedly prioritized political chemistry over geography, and there were some reports this morning that the campaign had concerns about Shapiro, worried he might upstage her because he clearly has his own ambitions for higher office down the road. So that may explain why, in the end, she leaned towards Minnesota nice by selecting Governor Tim Walz. He's a folksy, charming Midwesterner with progressive credentials and the backing of labor unions. Now, the two apparently hit it off, and Harris posted a video of her phone call with him when she offered him the job. Take a listen.
Hi, this is Tim.
It's Kamala Harris. Good morning, Governor.
Good morning, Madam Vice President.
Listen, I want you to do this with me. Let's do this together. Would you be my running mate and let's get this thing on the road?
I would be honored, Madam Vice President.
The joy that you're bringing back to the country, the enthusiasm that's out there, it'll be a privilege to take this with you across the country.
Yeah, so that wasn't staged at all, but it's effective, and Democrats are hoping that this will keep and sustain that enthusiasm in the base. Now, the campaign believe Walz can help balance the ticket. He's a two-term governor, former congressman, teacher, military veteran, proud gun owner whose Midwestern style and small-town roots could attract moderate and independent voters who might be skeptical of a Harris presidency. But what's really interesting here is Walz was once considered a long shot in the Democratic Veep states, but he quickly vaulted to top contender because of his progressive track record and support from labor unions. But his folksy insults of the Republican ticket went viral and copied by other Democrats. Remember this?
Where's the plan? He doesn't have one, and these weird ideas, and I'll stay to that. I still say this. People can feel this. Why does the guy never laugh? Like, laugh with people, but laughing at people.
These guys are just weird. That's who they are. So it isn't much else. Don't give them the power. Don't lift these guys up like they're sometimes the heroes. Everybody in this room knows, I know it as a teacher, a bully has no self-confidence. A bully has no strength.
So he's an effective communicator. He comes from the Midwest. Minnesota is not a swing state, but when he was a congressman, he flipped a district that was held by the Republicans. Now, in the end, Walz's ascendancy caps 3 short weeks of a frenzied vetting by the Harris campaign, and now it's off to the races. Walz will make his debut tonight in Philadelphia as the VP contender, and then Walz and Harris are off on an ambitious tour of 7 swing states in over 5 days.
Well, Richard, you know what they say about the importance of first impressions? Clearly, they're trying to depict Walz as a folksy, small-town leader, as you say. This is also an opportunity for the Trump campaign to set the tone for how they want to respond. How is the Trump campaign responding now?
Yeah, they were quick to respond, trying to paint the Harris-Walz ticket as an extreme left-wing agenda, and they were zeroing on Walz's slow response to quell the unrest in Minneapolis after the George Floyd murder, really trying to paint Walz as being weak on crime. Take a listen to Republican VP candidate J.D. Vance.
Tim Walz's record is a joke. He's been one of the most far-left radicals in the entire United States government at any level. But I think that what Tim Walz's selection says is that Kamala Harris has bent the knee to the far left of her party, which is what she always does.
So, battle lines drawn. Now, remember, this is a big adjustment for Team Trump. They built their campaign to focus on Biden and Harris. Now it's Harris-Walz. So a lot of their prior ads, messaging, and branding is out the window. It appears they're looking at the crime angle and, of course, the economic angle. But the other big question now is, will Harris and Trump debate each other on a televised debate? Because it's unclear where or if those negotiations are ongoing. But the election is 3 months away, and the dynamics and the race has changed completely.
Battle lines drawn indeed. Thank you, Richard. The CBC's Richard Madden in Washington. Some initial reaction includes Democratic North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper expressing his excitement about Harris's choice.
Governor Walz will work to protect middle-class families, protect reproductive freedom. he will be an outstanding governing partner and running mate with Vice President Harris. People who know Tim Walz like him a lot. He understands what everyday people go through. He was a public school teacher. I'm very excited about this pick, and I know that they'll make a good team.
But what will Harris choosing Tim Walz as her running mate mean for her presidential campaign? I'm joined now by Michele Manatt, who is also a Democratic strategist and former senior policy advisor at the U.S. State Department. Hello, Michele, and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good evening, Brett. Thank you for the invitation.
My pleasure. So let's start with your reaction. Clearly, there's two narratives emerging right off the start. What did you make of Harris's decision here?
I think it was a brilliant decision. It was very carefully thought out, even though on a very compressed timetable. I think it's evidence of the importance of relationships, how many times Joe Biden has invited the National Governors Association to spend time at the White House, both in formal dinners and in less formal meetings. And over the course of those meetings, Vice President Harris has gotten to know the leading Democratic governors and Republican governors of this country, as is a responsible vice president does. And I think that she looked for someone who complements her in various issue areas and experiences, but who she also felt comfortable with and knew that this is like getting on a plane, boarding a plane at top velocity. She knows what that's like because she was in this exact place 4 years ago. And I think that she has really reassured many, many constituencies of the Democratic Party, and I believe curious independents as well with this pick.
Well, I want to point to some reporting from Reuters yesterday that Harris had narrowed her picks down to two. Walz was obviously one of them. The other was Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro. He is the governor of a battleground state. He would have been the first, potentially the first Jewish vice president. What do you think gave Walz the edge over Governor Shapiro?
I think a number of things. I think it's really the calculus for how to go after Trump and Vance with voters who have eluded Democrats for a long time, as we saw in 2016 in particular, and that painful, narrow loss that Hillary Clinton had. I think the fact that he's from Minnesota, which is an adjacent state to the blue wall states, those that we must carry, like Michigan and Wisconsin, made him very, very interesting. I also think he has a lot of different kinds of governing and legislative experience, and that is vital. No question about it. You've seen over the course of Joe Biden's presidency how much working with the Congress effectively, truly that goes on behind the scenes that isn't necessarily out in the open with reporting, but the information game, the persuasion game that goes on to get the various core pieces of legislation passed and then rolled out. That is something Tim Walz has direct knowledge of because he was a member of Congress from the southernmost geographical district in Minnesota from 2006 until beginning of 2019. I think that's vital. That's something that Josh Shapiro doesn't bring. But I also think there was a fair amount of concern about his statements and his position vis-a-vis the terrible ongoing humanitarian crisis and conflict that it started with October 7th and the hostage taking and the indiscriminate killing of 1,200 Israelis, but then has morphed and exploded into much, much more. I think that Governor Shapiro's comments there were very problematic, and there's no way you can undo them, frankly. They're there. You can't, there's nothing particularly that way you can nuance that. And I think that young people in this country, meaning those under the age of 35, our constituency that Vice President Harris is keen to get to. I think that's something that she needed to kind of move around. She would have had to confront it directly head on had it been Governor Shapiro.
Well, you mentioned a couple different voter groups that the Harris campaign might be looking at. Voters in Midwestern states, youth voters, perhaps there's an effort to go after rural voters as well. What exactly does Walz bring to the ticket that could help with voters like that?
There's a Rural Americans for Harris Walz call tonight at 8 o'clock. Eastern Time that I plan to be on. He brings representation of a rural district. He grew up in a town of 400 people. He understands, he has lived, he knows. He is the personification of rural America. I will also point out that in his district, which spans almost the width of the state of Minnesota in the southernmost part of the state, is the city of Rochester, Minnesota, which is home to one of the premier medical clinics and research facilities, the Mayo Clinic, where some of the leading treatments and experiments and research on the perplexing health challenges of our time are being worked on. Those are also issues that Governor Walz is very familiar with. Healthcare, the more equitable delivery of healthcare is something that this country badly needs, and Joe Biden, together with Kamala Harris, have been fighting for from when they were first elected, even before they took office. He also brings, as I mentioned, that congressional experience, which means that he doesn't have to introduce himself to all of the different members of Congress that make up the Democratic caucus. Many of them know him already, which is such an advantage. And that's why, particularly over the past 10 days, we saw a growing chorus of support for Governor Walz from the Democratic caucus, which is varied, as we know. It has more blue dogs or centrists. It has progressives. It has Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others.
Well, let me jump in there because you made 3 points there, and I want to follow up on 2 of them before we get to the third point you just made. The first 2 points are about his qualifications, that he is from rural America, and that he's qualified. I want to ask you about the Trump campaign's response. They are contradicting at least the first point there. Trump's running mate J.D. Vance says Walz, quote, knows nothing about small-town America. He's accusing him of trying to import, quote, the California dream that's also every American's nightmare. How do you respond to that line of attack coming from the Republicans?
Laziness. All I'm seeing is laziness out of the Trump-Vance campaign. They are like a balloon with no helium. They squandered what they earned, what they put on with their convention in Milwaukee. They took it to the heart of America, to a very interesting city, really, with a lot of racial tensions, but with a lot of old line legacy businesses and a lot of interesting ethnic communities. And they squandered what they built there because they just don't have the decency within them. Governor Walz is saying that they're weird. I think that's actually very politic and polite of them. That's very diplomatic to call them weird. They just literally live and breathe the air of a different America. They are not in communication or in community with actual Americans. J.D. Vance has nothing but gall to say something like that. But look, he's been a gall spewer for years and years now. And he's gone to different key backers, including Peter Thiel, who's very controversial, to fuel his journey. That's exactly how he got to where he is. It is very interesting to hear the criticism and the analysis of his book, Hillbilly Elegy, this many years on. So more than 12 years on, looking back and analyzing that book and how that book really came to be. Tim Walz legitimately comes from a town of 400 people. He has represented scores of towns that are small, that have no immediate access to emergency rooms or quality health care or to lots of choices in their classrooms because it's rural America. I happen to be very familiar with the state of Iowa, where my parents both grew up. I was there just in June. I know exactly the kind of man and the kind of challenges and the kind of solutions Walz has brought. Vance has nothing to offer. In fact, he really is just a glad-hander, and he shows up for propaganda moments, which is what made him appealing to the Trump sons, who really were the broker.
But the question is, Michele, how do you think that messaging will play out with voters? Because on your second point, as I mentioned, with experience does come accountability. It appears that the Trump campaign is going to try and make Walz accountable for his record as governor of Minnesota. They're already pointing to some of those things he presided over, such as the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic and the violence following the murder of George Floyd. So how do you think that rhetoric's going to resonate with voters, with some of these key voters we've been discussing?
I think voters take these matters seriously, more seriously than the media actually gives them credit for. And I think that we need to focus on how we got to where we are, but how we're going to address the needs that are right in front of us and what's coming ahead. To simply talk about someone's record and criticizing what they did at a time when J.D. Vance had to make nothing like the decisions that Tim Walz had to make for the citizens of his state with COVID, with then the tragic murder of George Floyd, kind of at the peak of COVID at the end of May in 2020, shows how shallow he is. They have nothing real to offer. And the number of opinions and reflections that have come forth about J.D. Vance in the past 2.5 weeks without that much digging has been extraordinary. You've had people throughout his life who have talked about how they don't recognize J.D. Vance, the J.D. Vance of now. He also just doesn't give off a caring vibe. When you see him interviewed, when you see him interact with people, it's like there's this safe zone around him. Nobody actually wants to get proximate to J.D. Vance because they don't know what he might do. And he managed to...
All right, Michelle, unfortunately, I've got to cut you off there. We're out of time, but there's a lot to discuss, and certainly we are keeping an eye on the live event coming up shortly to see how the Harris campaign tries to maintain this momentum. So I want to thank you, Michele Manatt, Democratic strategist and former senior policy advisor at the U.S. State Department.